Okay, we're at the bottom of Kuf Yud Aleph and Aleph, 111a. We're at the 2 dots, 5 lines to the bottom of the page. Nosanle Esa Karen. 111a. And about seven lines in the bottom of the page. Okay, just a brief review of the Mishnah. Again, yesterday we're talking about the atonement of somebody who lies under oath about his stolen item. And we said that, okay, and in this case, he stole from a convert. So we said the atonement is that money goes to the Kohanim and a sacrifice has to be brought. Now, the truth of the matter is, every time you lie under oath, it doesn't make a difference what type of oath it is, whether it's an oath that was prescribed by the court, or whether it's an oath that was not prescribed by courts, whether it was monetary related or non-monetary related. You know, whether you were obligated or not, the general principle of making an oath is that you have to pay. The atonement for an oath is a sacrifice, and if there's money involved, principal has to be returned plus a fifth, which in English we're more fond of saying 25%. Okay. Now, and like we said before, and now with regard to a convert, the problem is you can't return it to him because he's deceased and he doesn't have inheritors, presuming obviously he doesn't have inheritors. So what do? You bring it to the temple and you bring a sacrifice with it. Now, like we explained, the money has to be brought at the same time or before the sacrifice. To bring the sacrifice first and then the money is not valid. And that's
why is that again, Rabbi?
I'm sorry?
Did we figure out why that is yet?
I think we're getting into it right now. Right now. Open your Talmud, 111a, 2 dots, 6 lines in the bottom of the page.
It'll take me a minute. My technologically superior approach means I'm gonna need a minute to do that. Go ahead.
How do we know that if he brings his me'ilah is the sacrifice. The word asham, like we pointed out before, asham often means a sacrifice. It's often a substitute for a type of sin offering. The type of sin offering that a person who lies under oath brings. But asham in context also refers to the monetary payment. So if you bring the sacrifice, but you didn't bring the payment, you don't fulfill the obligation until you bring both. Talmud Leimar, be'ela asham v'nislach lei. 1 second.
You say 111a, Rabbi?
111a. So be'ela asham v'nislach lei means that you bring the sacrifice and then you have an atonement. Now the first part of the verse, which the Gemara, the Talmud doesn't mention, talks about making the payment, bringing the sacrifice, v'nislach lei, and then you have atonement. What does that tell you? You need to have both. Okay. How do you know that if you bring the money without bringing the sacrifice, you don't fulfill the obligation? Talmud Leimer be'ela asham. Ha'asham b'kvar. Be'ela asham means the Gemara, the Talmud is interpreting this as the sacrifice that's brought after the money was returned. Okay, because we know that money and sacrifice are necessary for atonement, maybe the fifth is also necessary. Meaning, the sacrifice, the ayal means literally a ram. The osham in this case means the atonement money. The ayal and the osham, v'nitzlach that ayal v'osham ma'akvin behektish. You need the sacrifice and the money that requires. I'm sorry, ma'akvin behektish. Those are required for atonement. The ein chaimish ma'akiv, but a fifth is not required. Okay, 1 second.
Page, please, Rabbi.
3 lines in the bottom of the page.
All right.
Actually, I'm sorry, 2 lines. 2 lines in the bottom of the page. Second word of the line. V'yilmad hektish mehedit. Okay, so the Gemara is pointing out that this atonement, like we said, a principle, a fifth, and a sacrifice, is not just an atonement for any type of oath. It's also an atonement for me'ilah. Me'ila is when you misuse property that's been dedicated to the temple funds, what we call hektish. So this verse is actually not referring directly to atonement for stealing from a convert and lying under oath about it, but it's referring to atonement for misusing hektish. So the Gemara says, "V'yilmed hektish mehedit v'hedit mehektish," and stealing from hektish, which has the exact same penalty as stealing from a convert and lying under oath, and then he dies. Those two are learned to each other. V'yilmed hektish mehedit. Hektish is learned from hedit. From hedit means non-sanctified stuff. That's all interactions between people that don't relate to the temple. That's what we call hedit. Simple. Hektish, temple funds, that's called hektish. V'hedit mehektish. So hektish is learned from regular people. Regular people learn from hektish. Let's explain. Hektish mehedit. Hektish is learns from regular people. Ma asham dehasam karen. Af asham dehacha karen. Just like the word asham in context of stealing from a convert, lying under oath, and then he dies, the word asham refers to the principle. It refers to payment of the money that was actually stolen. So af asham dehacha karen. So too, when we read this verse, be'el ha'asham, we learn ha'asham means the principle. So for example, if you misuse from hektish firewood, right? So firewood is a good example because it's consumable. So the principle is the firewood, right? And you'd add a fifth on top of that. Okay, and then v'hedyet me hektish, we learn hedyet from hektish. Ma hektish ein chamish ma'akev, af hedyet nami ein chamish ma'akev. Just like by hektish, paying the fifth is not necessary for atonement. So too, with regard to lying under oath, paying the fifth is not necessary for atonement. The key components for atonement are the return of principle and the sacrifice. And Hadron Lacha goes Leitzim, that concludes the 9th parak. Yeah, the 10th parak. Hagoizel u'meichel Okay, so an interesting scenario here. What's going on here? He stole, and he gave to his kids to eat from the stolen item. Or he left an inheritance before them, and in the inheritance was a stolen item. Peturin milashalom, the kids are exempt from paying. We'll have to see why. This is not so simple. This we also have to explain. I'll give you I'll jump the gun a little bit here. If there was achrayas, responsibility, then they have to pay. What does that mean? There are two understandings of what this means. I'm really going a little bit ahead. We'll get to it in a few minutes. One possibility is achrayas means he has real estate. As we've spoken about many, many times in the past, real estate is called nechosim sheyesh behen achrayas, assets that have responsibility. The reason why real estate is considered significant is because
it's not going anywhere.
It can't go anywhere. Can't go anywhere. It's fixed. That, in a certain sense, that's in English why it's called real estate. Focus on that word, real.
Except if you're on the coastline.
Yeah. There are Talmud,
Except if you're on the coastline.
there are Talmudic passages that talk about such property. There's a word in Talmud for when your property is flooded like that. Okay. So real estate has responsibility because you can't hide it. And that's why it has primary responsibility in terms of any loan, any obligation, primarily the obligations on real estate. Okay, that's one possibility. So in other words, if the father has real estate, then he has to pay back for his stolen item. Fair enough? Okay, the other possibility is that, 1 second. Oh, the other possibility in Yeshem Achrayas means that the stolen item is still extant, it's still around. So he stole a car, right? The kids were using it; they thought it was his car, and they got a notice from the government or something, or they looked at the title, they found the title after he died. They realized it's a stolen car, or they couldn't find the title after he died. It's probably a better way to do it, right? So he couldn't find the title. The car is stolen, and therefore they have to return the car. Car could be returned as is, right? The Gzela is still around. You return the car as is. Okay, so let's go. We'll see this. The simple version of the Mishnah has potentially a lot of problems, and we'll have to resolve them. So Amar Rav Chizda starts off. You stole, and the owner did not give up from reclaiming the stolen item, either because he doesn't know about it, or because he thinks that he has recourse. Either he'll hire a bunch of bouncers, maybe he'll go to the court system, but he thinks he's pretty confident he's getting it back. Okay, now the key thing when talking about a stolen item, there are two key components to acquire it. We call these Yush and Shini Rishus. Yush is giving up. The owner basically gives up hope of getting it back. He doesn't think there's recourse for him to get it back. And it has to change domain. This would be something like the robber selling it or giving it to his kids, or the kids consuming it if it's inedible, or whatever, if it's consumable. Okay. So the owner, let's say, didn't know about it, or he thinks it's recourse. He didn't give up yet, and then somebody else comes and eats it. Okay, so what happens? They're both thieves. The second guy is not necessarily a thief, but because he's ate something that belongs to its original owner, so therefore, you can collect from either one. My time, this still belongs to the original owner. So effectively, you ate something belonging to somebody else. You had no right to eat it, even though you thought you had a right to eat it. Presumably, the robber told you that you have the right to eat it. Doesn't make a difference. Ultimately speaking, because he did not give up, it's still in his domain, and you have to pay him. You can collect from either person. So now we learned the Mishnah basically seems to imply the otherwise, right? The Mishnah says you steal and you give it to your kids are exempt. Well, why are they exempt? If the owner did not give up, at least yet, from getting back the stolen items, your kid ate somebody else's stuff. Why don't they have to pay for it? So the Gemara says, this is a question of Ches. Which is better, the Mishnah is referring to after Yush, meaning the robber has already given up on the stolen item. Therefore, by the kids eating the stolen item, that's the Shini Rishus. That's change of domain, and therefore they acquire it and they're exempt from payment. Okay, next Gemara. If he left it as an inheritance, they're exempt from paying. Okay, let's see the next problem with the Mishnah. Yomi Bava Kamma. Yomi Bava Kamma said, Zaysemeris, from here we see Rishus Yerish Rishus Lekech Dami. The domain of an inheritor is like the domain of a buyer. In other words, just like if somebody buys a stolen item and the owner has already given up on getting it back, the buyer acquires the stolen item and has no responsibility to return it at all. Same thing is true of an inheritor, because in some ways, an inheritor is stronger than a buyer, in some ways he's weaker. In the sense that he's weaker is because he doesn't actually acquire everything. If a person's parents die and he inherits his parents, he doesn't need to acquire the items. They're his automatically. It's a sort of a kinyan bal karcha. You get it. It's just yours. That's it. You don't have to acquire it. So in that sense, it's both stronger and weaker. It's stronger that you don't, becomes yours immediately, but also it doesn't require a kinyan, meaning there's less of a transaction here than there is with a buyer. A buyer has more of a transaction because he has to acquire it. So, okay, nevertheless, Rabbi Kamma says, he's like a buyer. Rava says, no, it is not the case. An inheritor is not like a buyer and would have to return the item. We're talking about a scenario where he consumed it. So in other words, the father left the kids his stolen firewood, and the kids consumed the firewood. So it's not just, the truth is, if the firewood was extant, it was still around, then what? The kids would have to return it. Because even though the owner has given up from finding it, the fact that they inherited it is not a change of domain. It is not a change of domain, according to Rava. However, over here they consumed the firewood. That's a change of domain, and therefore they don't have to pay. So the Gemara says, "Hamiditani seifim." One second. Hold on a second. What does the end of the Mishnah say? If there was a achrayas responsibility, you have to pay. Well, what does that mean? What does responsibility mean? One second. 1 second. Okay. Yeah. Okay. As follows. So the Gemara presumes here that when there's responsibility, what it means is that there's the item that they have is something that's noticeably the father's. What does that mean? Let's say he has let's give an example here. He has a custom lawnmower. Okay, it's a big item, right? And you could hide it in the sheds, but everybody knows whose lawnmower this is, right? It has his family coat of arms on the side, something like that. And clearly, if the kids are going to be driving around with a lawnmower, it's very unseemly, right? It's disgraceful. So because of that, we say that the kids have to give back the item. In other words, the Gemara is interpreting Achrayas responsibility as an extant item that was stolen. But this extant item is unique that it's noticeable, right? It's the custom-made lawnmower with the coat of arms on the side. So you have to give it back. Meaning, but if it wasn't a custom-made lawnmower, right? If it was a third-hand lawnmower from the 1950s, like everybody else has, then presuming that everybody else has those type of lawnmowers, then there's nothing unique about it. Then nobody's going to notice, and they do not have to give it back. This contradicts Rava's opinion. There's a Rava saying that Rishus Yarish Lav Kushus Lekech. The inheritors do not transfer domain, and therefore they should have to give back if the stolen item is around. Rava interpreted the Mishnah as consumables, but the Mishnah seems to draw a different distinction. The distinction the Mishnah seems to be drawing is not with consumables. They're both extant. One of them, though, has the coat of arms on the side, and one doesn't. So one of them is extremely disgraceful, and the other one is not really. It's not as disgraceful because no one really knows about it.
What?
Disgraceful.
Okay.
We're differentiating here between whether the stolen item is extremely noticeable, something that, like we said, like a custom-made lawnmower with a coat of arms on the side.
All right.
It's very disgraceful that they're driving around what's clearly somebody else's lawnmower.
Okay.
If it wasn't like that, then they would be exempt from paying. This strongly seems to support the opinion of Rabbi Dovid Yehudah. Okay, the first half of the mission is also referring to a stolen item. Okay, so the Gemara says, no. We interpret achrayas nechasim. Responsibility doesn't mean something that's noticeably the father, something that's noticeably belonging to the original owner. What it means is that the father has assets to repay. If the father does not have assets to repay, then the kids are exempt from paying because they acquire all the movable items with shini rishos, change of domain. 1 second. No. It's also, no, take that back. Again. According to Rava, any item has to be returned. Any stolen item has to be returned. However, if the stolen item was consumed, there's a financial obligation. If this property in the amount of the financial obligation, then collect the property. And if not, then you can collect. If not, then they do not have to pay. Kids don't have to pay for the father's financial obligations if the father did not leave them property to pay. Okay. 1 second. Okay.
Still saying there was no change in domain.
So Rava's opinion is still going to be there's no change in domain. So if the stolen item is excellent, it would have to be returned. Okay, so the Gemara says, the problem is that this cannot be the interpretation of the Mishnah. Why? Because Rabbi Yehudah Hanasi, Rebbe, the author of the Mishnah, told his son that that's not the right Mishnah. Right? To think the author probably knows what he's talking about, right? We'll see, maybe not, but we'll get to it in a moment. The author says that what does achrayas mean here? It doesn't mean that there's assets to repay the financial obligation. It means that the stolen item is extant. So clearly, if the mission is referring to a stolen item that's extant, this contradicts the opinion of Rava. Rava says we're talking about a stolen item that was consumed, because if the item is extant, they do have to return it. And the mission is saying, no, even if the stolen item is extant, they still don't have to return it. Why not? Presumably because Rishus Yerush, Rishus L'Kachtami. Because the change of domain acquires the item, not like the opinion of Rava, and like the opinion of Yomi Bava Kamma. The Gemara says, El Amar Rava, Ki Shechivne Rav Oishia, when Rav Oishia passed away, Nafik Levasi. Rava was saying, when Rav Oishia dies, I'm going to go out to greet the bearer.
His position, please, Rabbi.
8 lines in the bottom of 111b. The Teritzna Mastisin Kava say, because he explained the Mishnah in a way that would support my opinion. What's my opinion? My opinion means that according to Rava, the Mishnah, the achrayas responsibility of the Mishnah does not refer to a stolen item that's extant, but it refers to property that can pay the financial obligation. So we explained. Rabbi Yehudah, and also the author of the Mishnah, held that the word achrayas responsibility means the stolen item is extant. And Rav Oishia interpreted, no. He said the stolen item is not extant. What we're referring to here is whether there's property to pay the financial obligation. The Tani Rav Oishia said, somebody who steals and gives it to his kids to eat, they're exempt. If he gave it as an inheritance to them, if the stolen item is extant, they have to return it. If the stolen item is not extant, they're exempt. If their father left property to repay the financial obligation, then they have to pay. Okay, so the second half of Rav Oishia clearly supports the opinion of Rava, because he interprets achrayas response. Now, it's true the first half does not support the opinion of Rava. It clearly goes with the opinion of Yomi Bava Kamma, because it refers to the stolen. It says that you're obligated to pay. The kids are obligated to return an extant stolen item. I'm sorry. No. That is. I'm saying that is right along with Rava. It's right along with Rava. It's not like Yomi Bava Kamma. Rava says the stolen item is extant. They do have to return it. He says they consumed it. That's why they're exempt, which is exactly like Rav Oishia. And Yomi Bava Kamma said otherwise. Now we go through Rav Oishia quickly. If the stolen item is not extant, they're exempt for paying. Name it to have a tiyuf to Rav Chisda. Let's say this is a question on Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda previously said that if one person steals it and the other person eats it, person 2 eats it, and the guy has not given up, then you can collect from either one. And over here we're saying that no, you can't collect from either one. The guy who ate it is exempt. Well, why is he exempt? And like we explained before, yeah, he's exempt if the owner is already given up. Because then the person that eats it does 2 things. He concludes the process of Shini Rishos, of changing domain, and therefore you have both a giving up of the owner and a change of domain, which means that it's acquired by the second person.
Wait, are we on 112A now? Rabbi?
No. 4 lines to the bottom.
I thought we're saying that it didn't change.
No, so now we're going back to the beginning of the bride. So what happened was one person stole it, the other person ate it. The person that ate it is exempt. Why is he exempt? According to Rav Chisda, the person that ate it is liable. And the answer between the 2 scenarios is very simple. If the owner is given up, then he's exempt. The robber is liable, the guy who ate it is exempt. If the owner did not give up on the item, so it's still his. Still, he actually owns it now. And he didn't give up on it. So therefore, the guy who eats it is responsible. Or could be responsible. The original owner can collect from either person. Okay. If the stolen item is extant, they have to return it. Name it to the Yomi Bava Kamma. This seems to contradict the opinion of Yomi Bava Kamma. Yomi Bava Kamma says Rishus Yerush, Rishus L'Kachtami, meaning that if they inherit it, then they do not have to return it, even if the item is extant. So the Gemara says this price refers to before the owner gave up. So meaning in this case, inheriting it does not, even though it's like you bought it, it's true, but if you buy a stolen item before the owner gives up, you're also exempt. Okay, we're top now, first line of 112a. Rav Ada bar Ava masni l'hodar Ram bar Kamma aha. Rav Ada bar Ava had Ram bar Kamma mentioned on a different set of laws. Okay, let's see. Aha. If the father left them a loan that he had given that had interest. No, it looks like not only that, the father collected most of the loan. So the father loaned to somebody with interest. This is a Torah prohibition to lend to another Jew with interest. By the way, to a non-Jew, you're obligated to lend with interest, as an aside. So if the father lent money with interest, he charged interest for it to another Jew. Even though they know that the money is interest that's prohibited by the Torah, they do not need to return it. Ram explains the reason why is because even though normally under regular circumstances, if you charge another Jew interest, you're obligated to return the interest. However, this is an exception. There is an exception. There is an exception with regard to the kids. Once they inherit it, they're exempt. Why? Because kids are like buyers. It's as if it changed domain. If it changed domain, it's no longer in the domain of their father, and therefore they're not responsible to return the interest. So Gemara says, Rava pointed out that this argument is not quite true. Why is that? It could be they're not considered like buyers; they're inheritors of the father. So why don't they have to return the ribis, the interest? The shiny hacha here is different. Amar kra atikach me'ite neshech v'tarbis. And the end of the verse is v'chaya chicha imach. Ahadu like yehechet in the nochi bahadach. What the Torah is saying is, if you charge interest, go return it to him. Why? Because he should live with you. You should be able to live together. So therefore, return the interest. But this is true. The day comes the Torah gives this advice in this enjoinment to this obligation to the father, the one who lent with interest. But to his children, the Torah does not give this obligation. So it could be that it has nothing to do with the question of whether an inheritor is like a buyer. It's a separate question, which is local. It's a local question with regard to the laws of ribis. It has nothing to do with the rest of the laws of inheritance. Because this is a question that pertains specifically to the laws of interest. Are kids obligated to return their father's interest or not? But it would not be applicable to another set of laws pertaining to inheritance. Okay. Okay, let's explain it. The opinion that says that Rami bar Kamma is willing to say that inheritors are like buyers with regard to ribis certainly will say it with regard to the laws of stolen items. Meaning, if Rami bar Kamma is willing to interpret the laws of ribis as a source to tell me that inheritors are like buyers, even though like we said, that's really a questionable source. Rava has a very strong counter argument there. His counter argument is, who says? Maybe it's a local law pertaining to ribis, to interest, to loaning with interest. Maybe it's not a global concept. So if Rami bar Kamma still found a global concept with regard to the laws of ribis, for sure that global concept would apply to the laws of stolen item, where the kids acquire their father's stolen item and therefore are exempt from payment. However, if Rami bar Kamma only said it with regard to a stolen item, it isn't necessarily the case that he would. We don't know what his opinion would be with regard to interest, because interest, it could be he would agree to Rava that interest is not because of this global law of Rishus Yarosh Rishus Lekach, but it's because of a specific local idea to the laws of interest. Does that make sense?
Sort of.
Was that?
Sort of. Yeah.
In other words, it is splitting hairs, no question. Especially this version. There's another version of the same Gemara. There's a different textual variation. Rashi discusses it.
Oh.
This is a very unique category of the Gemara plays this game often, but this one is in this context. It is absolutely splitting hairs because it makes no difference, which is why probably Rashi has an alternative textual variant. So let me explain again briefly. There's two statements in Rami bar Kamma. There's the interest statement, there's the robbery statement. Okay? If Rabbi Kamma made the interest statement and found a global law in the interest statement, I'm just talking here in very general terms, so you should get the conceptual framework of what's going on. If Rabbi Kamma made the global statement by interest, that same global statement can also be inferred from the laws of stealing. However, if Rabbi Kamma made the global statement inferred from the laws of stealing, it would be a global inference, but you would not be able to make that same deduction from the laws of interest, which is weird. Why? Because the laws of interest would have the global application, but it wouldn't be necessary to invoke it. Why not? Because it's local. Because the laws of interest are local. It's not a global concept. It's a local concept. Now, yeah, it is splitting hairs because, like we're saying, the inferred law would still be applicable. It's just that it couldn't be deduced from interest, which is a weird take. It is a splitting hairs take, and that's not usually the case when the Gemara does this. And because of that, I think Rashi does change, amend the text, the textual variant. Okay, fine. Talking about it next onward. Somebody who steals and gives it to his kids, they're exempt from paying. And from them, if he puts it in front of them as an inheritance, adults are liable, kids are exempt, which is a little bit different than the Mishnah. The Mishnah says they're both exempt. But the Gemara says, if the adults say we don't know our father's bank accounts, we don't know exactly where his money went, so then they're exempt. So the Gemara says, because they say that they don't know, does that exempt them? 1 second.1 second. Okay, so the Gemara asks, because they say they don't know, does that exempt? Is that a reason to exempt them? Sort of what type of argument is that? The adults are liable to pay, but if they don't know, then they're exempt. Well, why is that? So the Gemara says, no, there's a change of the text. If the adults say they do know, and they know that their father does not owe you money, in this case, let's say there's no real estate to collect the assets, so then P'turin, they're exempt as well. If he feeds his kids, they're exempt from paying. Feeds his kids, he steals and feeds it to his kids, they're exempt. If he leaves it as inheritance, and they consume it, they have to pay for consuming it. So Gemara says, 1 second. If a child damages somebody, they're exempt from paying. So if a child eats his father's stolen item, why would he be liable? So Amar Papa Hachikamar. So Papa explains. If he left them an inheritance, stolen firewood, and they had not consumed it, adults and children must return the stolen item. This is like the opinion of Rava. Okay. So Amar Rava, if their father left them a borrowed animal, they can use it as long as the period of borrowing until the end of the period of borrowing. So if a guy borrowed an ox for a week and he dies in the beginning of the week, the kids can keep the ox until the end of the week. Okay, interestingly, Mesa, let's say the animal suddenly dies, they are not liable for einus. The general obligation of a shayl, of a borrower, is everything. The only exception is if there's damage that occurs in the normal course of work. They call wear and tear. Wear and tear he's not liable for. He's liable for everything else, including things that are beyond his control, and he has no way of controlling, including the sudden death of the animal. The animal suddenly dies, and a borrower is liable to pay. However, these kids, because they didn't actually borrow the animal, they inherited a borrowed animal, ein chayavin ba'einsei. They are not liable for ninus, for sudden unpredictable incidents. Now we have an interesting scenario. They thought it belonged to their father. And they slaughtered it and ate it. They pay the price of meat, but you subtract a third of the price of meat. Why? Because had they known it wasn't their father's, maybe they would have been eating less meat. So you evaluate the animal for its meat, you subtract a third, and that's the payment. Let's say the father left real estate, then they do have to pay, because the real estate has to pay. Okay, this last line, the pertaining to the real estate. Some read it on the Resha, some read it on the Seifa. What does that mean? Some interpret this as if their father had assets, real estate, and the animal dies from a sudden unpredictable event, then the kids are liable because the father's assets are liable. And some say, where if they thought it was their father's animal and they slaughtered the animal, turns out it was a stolen animal. If the father has real estate, the father's real estate is obligated to pay the full value of the animal. So let's explain. The opinion that interprets it referring to the liability for einsim, for sudden, unexpected events, certainly would be the case that if they mistakenly slaughtered an animal, that the father's real estate would have to pay for the full animal. And this would disagree with the opinion of Rav Papa. 1 second. Okay, we'll see what Rav Papa says in a moment. The one who interprets this on the end of the Mishnah, refers to where they thought the animal belonged to their father, but it turns out it didn't, and they slaughtered the animal. So the full value of the animal is paid from the father's real estate. If that's the version, but with regard to the laws of einsim, a sudden incident, the father's real estate would not be liable to pay for a sudden event for the borrowed animal. Again, there are two components here. They mistakenly slaughtered it, and it suddenly died. And the Gemara says that if there's real estate, they have to pay. One interprets that statement referring to both the scenario where it suddenly died and where they mistakenly slaughtered it. The other opinion says no, only where they mistakenly slaughtered it. That's when the father's real estate has to pay for the full value of the animal. But if it died suddenly, they would not be liable. Even the father's real estate would not be liable to pay. Behind under Rav Papa, and that's the opinion of Rav Papa. Well, what did Rav Papa say? The Rav Papa haisapar genuvalo tavcha b'Shabbos chayev shkar chayev b'gneva kodim sheyava de iser Shabbos. A guy steals an animal on Thursday, slaughters it on Shabbos. He's liable. Even though normally we say kam le'b'derab minei, you'll get a much worse penalty for violating the laws of Shabbos, so she'd be exempt from the financial penalty. But we don't invoke that here because the original thievery happened on Thursday. Because the thievery happened before the violation of Shabbos. However, in the case of a borrowed animal that was slaughtered on Shabbos, then the stealing happens on Shabbos. The slaughtering is the stealing. They both happen on Shabbos, and therefore you're exempt. Therefore you're exempt because you have a much more severe penalty. The point of the statement of Rav Papa is that that a borrowed animal does not. You're not liable for the liability of einsim, of sudden death occurs when it occurs, not at the moment that it's of the original borrowing. And therefore, because the kids did not borrow the animal, they would not be liable according to Rav Papa, and nor would the father's assets be liable if there was a sudden death that occurs while the kids have the once the father dies. Once the father dies, it's a sudden death. The kids are not liable, nor are the father's assets responsible. Okay.